The 30-Year War was one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. It was fought primarily in Germany, but it also involved most of the other countries of Europe. Initially, the war was fought largely as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire. But dispute over the internal politics and balance of power within the empire played a significant part. Gradually, the war developed into a more general conflict involving most of the European powers.
When we study the 30 Years' War, we come across this view that the war was mainly fought on religious lines. But how far it was a religious war, or how far it was ostensibly a political one, you will be able to deduce that, or you will be able to conclude that as we discuss the topic.
The 30-Year War can be divided into 4 phases: the Bohemian Revolt, Danish intervention, Swedish intervention, and the French intervention.
The 30 Years' War was started when the Austrian Habsburgs wanted to keep intact their position in their hereditary lands of Austria and Bohemia. And they also were intent on gaining control over the Holy Roman Empire, which was, of course, as you know, the most important seat of power. Anyone who could control the Holy Roman Empire would be given the most important position in European power politics.
By 1617, it was apparent that Matthias, the Holy Roman Emperor, would die without an heir and would be succeeded by his nearest male relative, Archduke Ferdinand II. Ferdinand, having been educated by the Jesuits, was a staunch Catholic who wanted to impose religious uniformity in his land. This made him highly unpopular in Protestant Bohemia. The nobility's rejection of Ferdinand, when his representatives were thrown out of the window into a pile of horse manure, triggered the 30-Year War in 1618. Had the Bohemian Rebellion remained a local conflict, the war could have been over in less than 30 months. However, Emperor Matthias died and Ferdinand took the throne. This emboldened the Protestant leaders. Ferdinand was compelled to call on his nephew, King Philip of Spain, for assistance. The Bohemians, desperate for allies against the emperor, applied to be admitted into the Protestant Union. The union was led by the original candidate for the Bohemian throne, the Calvinist Frederick V. The Bohemians hinted that Frederick would become King of Bohemia if he allowed them to join the union and come under its protection. On 17th August 1619, Ferdinand was officially deposed as King of Bohemia and was replaced by the Palatine Elector Frederick V. However, with help from General Tilly, leading the Catholic League's army, Ferdinand II decisively defeated Frederick V at the Battle of White Mountain near Prague on November 8, 1620.
In 1620, Bohemia was crushed by a superior force in a very famous battle, the Battle of White Mountain, which was fought outside the famous city of Prague. Habsburg authority was reimposed in Bohemia, and Bohemia was Catholicized.
In addition to becoming Catholic, Bohemia would remain in Habsburg hands for nearly 300 years.
At the same time, we find that the Spanish troops were intent on establishing a link between what was the Spanish Netherlands, which is today's Belgium, and we have the Spanish positions in northern Italy. They were intent on maintaining the communication lines between the northern Italian possessions as well as the Spanish Netherlands, which is Belgium. This route was very crucial to them because in 1621 their agreement with the Dutch came to an end and war resumed between the Spaniards and the Dutch.
This phase of the war consisted of much smaller battles, mostly sieges conducted by the Spanish army. Mannheim and Heidelberg fell in 1622 and Frankenthal was taken 2 years later, thus leaving the Palatine in the hands of the Spanish.
The Dutch, on their part, encouraged opposition to the Habsburgs in Germany. Ferdinand entrusted his troops to a Bohemian military entrepreneur who was called Wallenstein. He was, of course, very famous, and he was successful in defeating the Dutch Ernest Count of Mansfield at a place called Dessau on 25th April 1626. Christian IV of Denmark was then encouraged to intervene on the Protestant side. At Luther, on 27th August 1626, he was defeated by Count Tilly, the general of the Catholic League, led by Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria. The Danes were driven out of North Germany in 1629 and were forced out of the war.
Negotiations were concluded with the Treaty of Lubeck in 1629, which stated that Christian IV could keep his control over Denmark if he would abandon his support for the Protestant German states. Thus, in the following 2 years, more land was subjugated by the Catholic powers.
Now, Ferdinand II, after this, was in a position which he could not secure, in the sense he could not consolidate his position, in spite of the fact that the Catholic League was successful, the army of the Catholic League, that is, was successful. And he was, or the most potent challenge to his authority came from Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. The period of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden is between 1611 and 1632. He was a warrior monarch, spent his early years fighting the Danes, that is against Denmark, Russia and Poland. But by the time it was the 1620s, he became increasingly concerned about the ascendancy of the Habsburg authority, and specifically on the German shore of the Baltic, and he was encouraged to act by France. France and Spain had maintained more or less passable relations, not very cordial, but at least they did not go into war with one another in the 1610s. But what angered the Spanish or the Spaniards was the fact that when Bohemia rose in rebellion, France and Spain had maintained, if not cordial, at least passable relations till the 1610, and France had done nothing to help the Bohemian rebellion. But after 1624 came the anti-Habsburg minister in France, who was Richelieu. He was the leading minister of Louis XIII, and obviously the relations between France and Spain deteriorated.
Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of King Louis XIII of France, felt that Habsburg were too powerful since they held a number of territories on France's eastern border. After the Swedish rout of Nordlingen in 1634, Richelieu made the decision to enter into direct war against Habsburg.
Within France, Protestantism was destroyed as a political or politico-military force with the successful siege of La Rochelle and Grace of Alice, one in 1627-28, that is the former La Rochelle, and the latter in 1629. But where his foreign policy was concerned, Richelieu chose to side with the Protestants. Because to him, the crushing of the Habsburg authority was much more important than Catholicism, or seeing that Catholicism was safeguarded in Europe. And so we find that Spain and France are embroiled in a war. This is the War of the Mantuan Succession in 1621-31 over the control of northern Italy. And Richelieu was intent on undermining the authority of the Habsburg in the Holy Roman Empire. And because of this, he in fact encouraged Gustavus to invade in July 1630. Gustavus landed at a place called Peenemünde, and the Swedes overran two important places. One was Pomerania and the other was Mecklenburg. The French won subsidies, and in April 1631, Gustavus moved into Brandenburg. Now, prior to this, we find that Magdeburg was a Protestant enclave, or was predominantly Protestant in his religious leanings. But it was brutally sacked by Tilly in a surprise onslaught by Tilly on that area. And this led to a kind of a fear psychosis in the minds of Brandenburg. So they chose to side with Gustavus when Gustavus landed there. In the same way, we find when Tilly advanced towards Saxony, that electorate also went to the camp of Gustavus. The first very important battle that was fought was on 17 September 1631. The two armies met at the battlefield of Bittenfeld, which was the largest or the biggest warfare in terms of manpower. Both sides had an enormous army, fielded in fact enormous armies. And Gustavus won the battle. This was because of the numerical strength and the resilience of the Swedish army. In spite of the fact that their Saxon allies were very inexperienced, the Swedes showed that kind of bravery and resilience which eventually benefited them and helped them to win the war, or rather the battle, not the war. And to the extent in which Swedish defensive position allowed them to use firepower. Particularly, they had a very, in comparison, their artillery was superior to that of Tilly.
মানে ক্ষেত্রে তো সামরিক বিপ্লবের দ্বারা খুব ভাবে মানে সামরিক বিপ্লব অনেকভাবে সাহায্য করেছিল।
The use of gunpowder does two things. One is it shortens the period of war, because you can achieve or you can attack your opponent, and the attack is much more lethal in comparison to the previous period. And if you have a better artillery, then your victory is more or less ensured. And this victory at Bittenfeld helped to or helped the Protestants in a way that reluctant German princes now started or joined the camp of the Protestant Gustavus. And Gustavus, of course, was not very content with his victory at Bittenfeld. He moved towards central Germany and he took places like Würzburg, Frankfurt, and the Saxons on their part took Prague. In 1632, Gustavus planned to overrun Bavaria. And of course, once Bavaria is conquered, the next would be to conquer Austria. Tilly was killed when he failed to stop the invasion of Bavaria, and Munich fell on 17th May. Ferdinand II was desperate. He reappointed Wallenstein. Actually, Wallenstein had been dismissed or removed because he was unpopular with the German princes. But obviously Ferdinand had no option then. He was desperate and he reinstated Wallenstein. We find that the general's threat to Saxony led Gustavus to move northwards. The Swedes now were not very successful against Wallenstein because Wallenstein at that time was cooped in a very fortified area of Alte Veste. What actually happened to the Swedes was this, that they lost heavily. They lost their personnel, the armed personnel heavily, because some of them deserted, a lot of them deserted, not some of them deserted, a lot of them deserted, and there were supply problems. That supply lines to the Swedes were cut off. So these two resulted in reverses of the Swedes against Wallenstein, though yet we do not have a frontal battle, because Wallenstein is holed up in a fortified place called Alte Veste. Wallenstein was now convinced that the campaign was over because more or less the Swedish army had dismantled, their supply lines were cut off, so he was quite contented that the war or the battle is at least over. And so he began to disperse his troops. Gustavus attacked him at Lutzen in 17th November 1632. This battle was an inconclusive battle, but what actually happened, much to the detriment of the Swedish troops, was that Gustavus was killed.
And the Protestant forces lacking his leadership were defeated at the First Battle of Nordlingen.
Now, after the death of Gustavus, after the fact that Gustavus was killed in battle, the initiative increasingly went into the hands of the Habsburgs. Wallenstein started following his own policy. He was a very independent sort of a person, and because of this he was removed by the king or by the emperor. At Nordlingen, a joint Austro-Spanish army defeated the Swedes. This was in 6 September 1634. This led to the Swedish loss of southern Germany, and we have the Peace of Prague in 1635, by which Saxony abandoned the Swedes. Most of the German Protestant princes were reconciled to the emperor, and the war was increasingly won. Now this is another very novel turn to the war. The war now became a war which was increasingly being fought by foreigners on the German side. Now, during this time, France so long was sitting on the fence. It first actively and then tacitly supported Gustavus. Now, once Gustavus was killed and the Swedes suffered reverses, and of course they were driven out of southern Germany, France entered the fray.
France declared war in Spain in 1635 and the Holy Roman Empire in 1636.
Louis XIII and Richelieu hoped to achieve success over Spain in one campaign. That is, one decisive battle would be fought. They did not want to prolong the warfare. As did the Spanish under, as did the Spaniards under Philip IV, and his first minister, who was Count Duke of Olivarez. But the large armies that one needs to fight decisive battles were lacking. Neither did the French have it, nor did the Spaniards.
The French military efforts met with disaster, and the Spanish counterattacked, invading French territory.
They went as far as Amiens and Corbie, and this invasion actually showed how vulnerable France was. And but we find that in spite of the fact that France suffered reverses, Richelieu remained intact in his office.
In 1642, Cardinal Richelieu died, and a year later, Louis XIII died, leaving his 5-year-old son, Louis XIV, on the throne. His chief minister, facing domestic crisis, began working to end the war.
The victory of the Swedes over the Danes, over Denmark, proves or shows what a decisive battle is all about. There is a difference between an inconclusive battle, where both sides suffer more or less the same losses, or where both sides win more or less the same victories. But in a decisive war, it is established once and for all who actually has won the war. Joint Franco-Swedish operation succeeded in 1645-48 in defeating the Austrians and Bavarians. This was one of the major that was one of the major reasons as to why the war started. Especially the Swedes wanted to control Austria and Bavaria.
On March 14, 1647, Bavaria, Cologne, France and Sweden signed the Truce of Ulm.
As the war ended, the Swedes were besieging Prague, and Prague, if you remember, was the original site of the conflict.
On May 15, 1648, the Treaty of Osnabrück was signed. Over 5 months later, on October 24th, the Treaty of Münster was signed, ending the 30-year war.
Together they are called the Peace of Westphalia. The Austrian, and we will see what were the terms of the Peace of Westphalia, who gained what. We find the Austrian Habsburgs were left in secure control of the hereditary lands which they were trying to protect. Remember, when we started it, we said that they were trying to protect the hereditary lands of Austria and Bohemia. They were able to do so. The Swedes gained much of Pomerania as well as the ecclesiastical principalities of Bremen and Verden. Sweden's position as the leading Baltic power was consolidated. This was one of its chief reasons as to why it entered the war. Brandenburg, Prussia, here you do not have what eventually became the German state under Bismarck. This is 17th century Germany, where you do not have a unified German state, but you have various German principalities. Brandenburg, Prussia, you have Saxony, you have so many other principalities. Brandenburg, Prussia also gained much territory, and what was important as far as German power politics was concerned was this, that Brandenburg, Prussia now replaced Saxony as the most important German power. And that is in northern Germany. It emerged as the most important northern German Protestant state, because if you remember Bismarck, then you'll know that one of the major problems that Bismarck had to confront was the problem that Germany was divided on the lines of religion. Northern Germany was Protestant, southern Germany was Catholic. France gained control over much of Alsace, and this Alsace remains such an important issue, which eventually the control of Alsace remained an important issue as far as France was concerned, because if you remember, then you'll know that it was the First World War was fought on the issue of Alsace. if you remember when the unification of Germany was taking place, Alsace was one of the most important places. Calvinism was recognized as an acceptable religion in the Holy Roman Empire, a major breakthrough for the Protestants. And the German princes were in effect left free to pursue their own foreign policy. No more hindrances from any other power, especially from the Holy Roman Empire. France and Sweden were made guarantors of this peace and given opportunities to intervene in German politics.
The 30-Year War rearranged European power structure. The edicts agreed upon during the signing of the Peace of Westphalia were instrumental in laying the foundations for what are even today considered the basic tenets of the sovereign nation-state. The Peace of Westphalia changed the relationship of subjects to their rulers.
The war caused terrible devastation in Germany.
So great was the devastation brought about by the war that it is estimated that the German population was reduced by about 15 to 30%. Pestilence of several kinds raged among civilians and combatants. The displacement of civilian populations and overcrowding of refugees into cities led to disease and famine.
But religious and political compromise, a kind of a religious and political compromise was reached. This religious and political compromise ensured that for the next 100 years, Germany did not witness any more conflicts.
ম্যাম এই সময় জার্মানি যে ক্ষতিগুলো দেখানো হয় যে মানে সমকালীন রচনা বলি বা বর্তমানে ঐতিহাসিকদের গবেষণায় যে জার্মানির ক্ষতি হয়েছিল এই যুদ্ধে খুব, কিন্তু যেই আর্থিক বা সামাজিক যে ক্ষতি দেখানো হোক বা জনসংখ্যা হ্রাস, কিন্তু দেখানো হয় যে কিন্তু বর্তমানে ঐতিহাসিকরা বলছে যে এই ক্ষতিগুলো বহুদিন আগের থেকে এই অবক্ষয় প্রক্রিয়াটা শুরু হয়ে গেছিল, এই যুদ্ধের জন্য ততটা হয়তো নয়।
It is undeniable that a war causes destruction. There can be no two opinions about that. But the devastation that Germany witnessed was of course partially because of the war. But if you look at the socio-economic problems that Germany faced, the war may have acted as a catalyst, but socio-economic problems were persistent. It is not that just because of the 30 years war, Germany faced other socio-economic problems that some historians would want us to believe.
Ma'am, why was it a prolonged war?
So many powers were involved in it. Each had their own game plan.
The 30-Year War marked the last major religious war in mainland Europe, ending the large-scale religious bloodshed accompanying the Reformation.